Good morning. I just love that the voice of God was a woman, okay? That did so much for me just now. I'm ready to go, okay? Now, I hope I didn't offend anybody by saying that. But I like to think that the source of all that there is embodies all of us. It's really a pleasure, a joy, and an honor to have been asked to share with you this morning. It gives me a great deal of pride to see how this work has grown over the last decade, to be touched by your stories and your progress, and the fact that the idea of first food, the idea of nurturing our children optimally, that idea has taken root and that we are really improving and increasing. We're not getting there as fast as some of us would like, but more of our children are getting access to mother's milk, and we don't have to continue to prove that it's necessary, you know, and that's indeed progress. When the largest foundation, I believe Gates is the largest foundation in the world still, when they decided to focus in on this issue, that was a big change in philanthropy. When the Kellogg Foundation first started to make this a priority, we were the only foundation doing that. We still have a long way to go to get other foundations involved, but we're excited that this movement is growing and gaining its momentum and power. I was asked today to talk about our newest enterprise, is the term that we are using. And we use the term enterprise because we don't want to suggest that it's temporary or short in length, that we know this may take a long time for it to actually be developed, but it's called Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. Now, why that long term? What is that about? Well, as you know, the Kellogg Foundation leadership, its board of directors, its CEO, realized long ago that in order to achieve our founder's mission and vision for helping children, we would have to deal with the elephant in the room. We would have to deal with the issue of racism. Now, it took a while for the foundation to come to that reality. There was a period of diversity, inclusion, multicultural. But finally, and it happened after our board became very diverse, the foundation felt that the issue, in this country for sure, had to be addressed head on. The idea of a belief in a hierarchy of human value. And it's really the idea itself. How many of you heard the Secretary of Transportation yesterday, Secretary Fox, talking about, you were here so you may not have heard it, but if you didn't, I would suggest you pick up online and listen to the Diane Rehm show. But he was talking about the truth that the US highway system was intentionally designed to destroy and break up minority communities. Now, how many of us have known that? But for the first time in the history of this country, a leader of the Transportation Department makes that statement. And not just to make the statement, not just to tell the truth, but to talk about what the implications are. What does that mean? What are the consequences? And most importantly, what are we going to do about it? And that is, in many ways, an example of what we mean by truth, racial healing, and transformation. The idea the belief that some people deserve more than others based on their physical characteristics. That belief is in the DNA of the United States of America. It's in our Constitution. It's in all our systems. When we talk about health equity, we talk about fixing the consequences of that. But when we talk about racial healing and transformation, we're talking about dealing with a root cause of it, which is permission to treat some better than others, based largely on their physical characteristics. So the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation enterprise is learning from the truth and reconciliation efforts that have happened all over the world, and some of them have happened in this country, in states. Perhaps the most recent happened in Canada, where they looked back at the boarding school system where the Native American children were taken from their families so that that which was their culture, that which made them Native Americans, could be taken out of them and destroyed. Now that report from Canada, that Truth and Reconciliation effort, actually used the term cultural genocide, that was a consequence of that boarding school experience. It was a powerful, powerful report. It was the first time we had a national effort on truth and reconciliation, in our hemisphere. But part of the motivation that got us to decide maybe America was ready for this was all of these exposures we've had over the last year and a half, 2 years, through our cell phone videos and social media, to police brutality. I think the latest one, I believe, there probably have been several since then, but the one that stands out in my mind, the image of a police officer shooting a young African-American teenager 16 times while he lay on the ground. Or the mystery behind Sandra Bland's alleged suicide after being stopped for a traffic stop. Or Michael Brown. Or in New York, I Can't Breathe. These things raise the public consciousness that something is terribly wrong with that system. And so you see op-eds in the New York Times and the Richmond newspaper saying, it's time for America to do a truth and reconciliation effort. And then the polling data over the last year clearly reflects that for the first time in American history, there is almost a consensus on the need to actually deal with racism head on. And for the first time in the data we've been collecting over the last decade, the white community, 60% of whites, are agreeing that we need to deal with racism. So the Kellogg Foundation feels it would almost be irresponsible not to step into this moment, given all of the investments that we've made to date, to help us get to this moment. Now I want to talk a little bit about some of what we've learned over the last decade. And you experienced it here, and we're very clear that story is such a powerful tool for shifting and changing ideas and behaviors. Why? Neuroscience teaches us that the human brain is wired to hold on to stories. Not necessarily to the data, but certainly to the stories that the data may tell. Patrick, when he spoke this morning, he talked about the stories of the women yesterday. Many of you in this room are advocates for breastfeeding because of your own personal stories and experiences. I sometimes tell the story of how my work in maternal and child health was driven by the loss of my firstborn. I can remember the last time I breastfed her like it was yesterday. And I put her in her crib, and when I went to get her the next morning, she had left us. But then I was gifted with another daughter who is now, I can't tell her age, she'd be mad at me. So, caught that. I know somebody in this room would tell her, your mother's telling people how old you are, so I'm not doing that. She is a millennial, that much I'll say. And some of you know I breastfed her until she walked up to me one day and snatched open my blouse. And I said, okay, you're weaned. Needless to say, she was more than 6 months old. But I'm very proud of her today and very thankful that I was gifted with 2 other healthy children. Some of you have seen my daughter on Meet the Press or MSNBC. And those of us who are real advocates for breastfeeding, and we know her, we jokingly say, see what breastfeeding will do? She's a lawyer and a real advocate for social change, too. But that experience of losing a child and having another child and learning everything I could possibly learn to do personally to optimize my health and the health of my children, that certainly charted my course in life. Some of you may be thinking, how does breastfeeding relate to truth and reconciliation? Truth and racial healing and transformation? Health equity? This is the way I see it. We don't have the luxury of one or the other. We have to do both. In other words, we have to deal with the consequences of a belief in a hierarchy of human value. We have to build our resilience and our capacity to thrive in spite of. But at the same time, if we're so privileged, we must do something to call it a lie, to unearth it, and to get rid of it. And so we find ourselves doing both. Now, there are debates, academic debates about should we be doing racial healing or should we be doing structural racism? I say we have to do both. And the model that we've worked on for the last decade at the foundation is doing both. Changing people's hearts and minds while at the same time dealing with the structural manifestations of the backward idea of a belief in a hierarchy of human value. But we really believe that. Some people still do, by the way. Some polls said that 20% of the followers of one presidential candidate actually think emancipation was a bad idea, that we should still have slavery in this country. So there is that small segment, although I'm afraid it might be growing, that actually still believes consciously in the hierarchy of human value, but most of us have internalized it unconsciously. And we act it out, not only in our relationships with one another, but in our relationships with ourselves. Because guess what? We can't give what we don't have. So if I think less of me, I'm going to project that diminished perception onto you. And I'm going to say that again. If I think less of me, little of me, if I'm so wounded, I am automatically projecting that woundedness onto others. And so the work of racial healing is not only the awareness of the atrocities, the annihilations, the cultural genocide, the slavery, the colonialism. It's also the work of understanding how those realities have been internalized and what they mean to our lived experiences. But most importantly, the work is freeing us from that so that we can have the capacity to see ourselves in the perceived other. Now, I'm not suggesting that that's easy, and I think there's some folks it'll take me a long time to see myself in them. But I do have that tape playing somewhere in my head that says, You shouldn't judge. You should find a way to extend your humanity to that perceived other. As some doctrines will tell you, there but the grace of God, go I. But this capacity to extend basically love to one another, that's really what racial healing is about. What would give a police officer permission to shoot that young man lying in the street 16 times? And then to go and destroy the videotape evidence that that had happened? What gave the planners of our nation's highway system permission to deliberately run those highways through minority communities? What gave permission for our schools to be more segregated today than they were when Brown versus the Board of Education decision was reached? What gives permission is our failure to address the fallacy of a belief in a hierarchy of human value. So when we imagine the work of truth, racial healing, and transformation, when we exhale when it's done, we will have a country that faced squarely the reality of that fallacy in its genesis and development, and came together to design to transform this country into a nation that no longer embodies that absurdity. That's a tall order, but this is the 21st century. Now, when this notion of a hierarchy of human value first took shape in in the world, it was during the first information revolution. And it proliferated through the printing press. There are some books that I can't read. It's too hard. How many of you have read Medical Apartheid? That's one that documents the role of racism in our medical system in the United States. That one I got through 2 chapters and it still sits on my shelf. But the notion of a hierarchy of human value found its way into anthropology. Actually, the anthropologists had a lot to do with perpetuating that fallacy, but they also were the first to stand up and call it a lie. But fast forward, from the 18th century to the 21st century, we're on the cusp, and we're just really at the beginning of it, of the second major information revolution. But if we don't clean this up now, guess what? All those algorithms, did I say that right? They're gonna embody the same fallacy. So all those, and listen, I'm stretching here, you all know this. I'd rather read a book than an ebook, but all those codes that are being written and all those things that are making our lives happen so quickly, all that information in the cloud, it's gonna really, really, really accelerate the embedding of this fallacy of a hierarchy of human value if we don't stop it now. There's never been a more critical time than now for doing this work. Am I suggesting that anybody in this room is a racist? Absolutely not. What I am suggesting is that we've all been swimming in the same water, and that water is this absurd idea. Now, I know the power of an idea. I happen to have a philosophy of life that says if you can conceive it, you can achieve it. And I have seen the power of focus and energy. One of the gifts of philanthropy is that we get to be a catalyst for amazing change in society. And we're not bound by as many restrictions as all the other systems. And the Kellogg Foundation is an amazing foundation because it uses that privilege to be catalytic, not just at the federal level or the state level, but where it matters perhaps the most, at the level of community. And as we envision the unfolding of the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation work, it's going to be in communities all over this country. Communities are going to come together and have safe spaces to unpack this absurd notion of white privilege, of racial hierarchy, and perhaps most importantly, what it has meant to their communities and what it continues to mean. And we at the foundation, we believe that there's this term that's used a lot in philanthropy, and it can be interpreted many ways, but it's called helping people help themselves. It's a phrase. But we honestly do believe that the solutions to these problems are held within the hearts and the creative minds of communities. And I don't know what the solution will be to school segregation, but I believe communities know how to fix that. And when called upon to do that, they will come up with creative ways to do that. More creative than legislating it necessarily, or a Supreme Court decision. Because guess what? That didn't work. So the work will unfold within communities all over this country. The one-on-one interpersonal work. So far, our goal is to have 100 of what we call charter organizations that are partnering with us. We're up to about 93 right now. And what makes an organization a good partner for this work is that that organization has tentacles, has outreach, has relationships all over the country. And imagine 100 organizations that have relationships with hundreds of thousands of people, all mapped together, all working together to design a way to do this work. And that's the phase we're in right now, of bringing those partners in, working with those partners, getting them to map their capacities. Because we don't actually believe this work has to be mandated from, and I love Washington, D.C. I'm not a hater. But we don't believe this work in its most effective form is going to be mandated from Washington, D.C. We believe this work is coming up and through the social infrastructure of this country, through communities. Now, I said earlier that there is a clear relationship between the breastfeeding movement and this Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation work. And I just want to be a little more clear about what I think that relationship is. It falls in that category of mitigating the consequences of exposure to discrimination and racism. You know, we talk a lot about social determinants of health, but we really talk about social determinants of pathology. We say social determinants of health, but our real focus is on social determinants of disease. We have yet to really get into social determinants of health. Breastfeeding is a social determinant of health and well-being. Optimal nutrition is a social determinant of health and well-being. We called breastfeeding first food because we saw it as part of the continuum of first food, early food, school food, and community food, a circular dynamic of making sure that we had optimal health and nutrition. And we know that those who are exposed to the most discrimination, the most racism, the most adversity, the most trauma, deserve optimal nutrition so as to help mitigate the bodily responses to that. When we first started doing the racial equity work under my leadership at the foundation, there was this suggestion that we should take it out of health and put it somewhere else. And I pushed back and I said, no, 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 no. Racism is a health issue. Racism is a life and death health issue. When we talk about health inequities and health disparities, we are really talking about the consequences of exposure to the adversity of being devalued as a human being. And so breastfeeding is a critical piece. Now, you know all the data about what it protects from and how it propels the infant to greater likelihood of health and well-being. But also, breastfeeding is about modeling a relationship of intimacy, of primary focus, of unconditional love, of bonding. There's a biochemistry of breastfeeding that we're learning more and more about. The hormone oxytocin, the hormone of relationships. There's a book called The Moral Molecule that talks about how oxytocin affects our ability to relate to one another as human beings, to be responsive and caring. Breastfeeding should be the new normal in America. Not just because it's going to make healthier babies, but it's because it's what nature intended. It's going to make healthier mothers. It's going to make healthier fathers. It's going to make healthier communities. And ultimately, we're going to be a healthier nation when most of our children, whoever could possibly be breastfed, when most of our children are breastfed. Now, am I guilt-tripping those who choose not to or who cannot? That is not my intention. But I think we have to move to where the expectation is that the continuation of the gestation experience, and it is that, the baby isn't fully developed when it comes out. It only comes out because the head is too big. But at that point, nature had a plan to continue and optimize that development at the mother's breast. And so this work is central to us becoming better human beings, to us becoming better able to relate to one another. And the work of truth, racial healing, and transformation is an intentional work to unearth and undo the absurd notion of the belief in a hierarchy of human value. We haven't ever done that as a country. We had a civil war, we had a civil rights movement, we have had other episodic moments. We have the Black Lives Matter movement right now in response to the tragedies. But these are episodes. We've never had a concerted, comprehensive, sustained, intentional, designed effort to undo the absurdity and to allow our true value as human beings to be fully embraced. And that's what this work is about. And I take my hat off to the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, to its CEO, LaJune Montgomery Tabron, to its leadership, Carla and Barbara Ferrer, and to its board of directors, to everybody at the foundation that has put a stake in the ground to carry this work forward. And if W.K. Kellogg Foundation is doing it, you can be guaranteed of one thing. It will be done, and it will be done well, but in partnership with all of you. Thank you.